I'm Jono Buchanan. Now, it feels a little bit wrong somehow to start a video talking about a plugin made by another manufacturer. It feels like I'm kind of cheating on my Logic marriage vows. But I've been playing recently with Soundtoys Filter Freak 2. I know. Nevertheless, one of the things that I really like about that plugin is that we have an opportunity to use two filters at the same time. And it got me thinking, what could I do if I was working with AutoFilter within Logic, and whether or not I can replicate some of the effects that I think Filter Freak is really good for. So last time I mentioned it, it meant nothing to me. Let's listen to this track. Okay, so like lots of tracks which use beat loops from the Apple loop, we've got too much stuff happening here. Now, the other thing to say is that something that quite regularly comes up on this channel is that the loop browser contains lots of beat loops that are called topper. In other words, they have no kick drum, and the idea is that they effectively offer a kind of hi-hat, upper percussion, maybe a bit of snare solution, ideally sort of placed to come in and provide some sort of percussive extra to the loops that you're putting together. And what I'm also wondering, in addition to seeing whether or not I can replicate that other thing I said before, is to see whether or not we can kind of turn this beat loop into something a bit more top-based, because there is a kick drum up at the top, which is already providing the foundation for the track. Okay, so what we're going to do is to focus our attention on this beat loop here. So obviously AutoFilter isn't two filters at once, but of course I can instantiate it more than once on my track. So firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a low pass filter treatment. Obviously I'm coming to the filter folder, AutoFilters here. And what I'm going to do is to select the default low pass filter. And what I have a chance to do firstly is to choose its cutoff frequency, which is fine. This is going to just control how much of the signal we're going to hear. But the bit that's always really interesting, again, this idea of bringing movement to our tracks, is to introduce some LFO shaping. What I'm going to do is to turn up the LFO amount. What I'm then going to do is to set the rate for it. I want something which is going to sort of unfold over a couple of bars. And I'm going to use this sort of triangle shape, which effectively is going to make the signal drop and rise and drop and rise. So effectively we'll have that happening. What I'm also going to do, just to give everything a little bit of sort of spice, is to turn up a little bit of resonance. Just a bit, nothing too extreme. Here we go. So that's filter one. We've literally got a little bit of shape on that, which is just producing this LFO movement. And in fact, actually, because there are going to be two filters, for now, what I'm going to do is to just slightly limit the LFO movement a tiny bit more. Nothing too extreme, but a little bit more. Okay, so what I want you to remember is that effectively the tone is changing in a way that is undulating up and down fairly predictably. Great. What we're now going to do is we're going to instantiate AutoFilter again. Because I've just used it, it's going to be sitting here in my most recents. So I'm going to add a second version. So this is filter 2. I'm going to put it here right next to the first one. Now this time I'm going to use the bandpass filter. So rather than letting through low frequencies and filtering out high frequencies, the bandpass filter is going to let through the frequencies that kind of sit in the middle of the available frequency spectrum. Okay, well that would be really straightforward if it weren't for the fact that the first filter is varying that first frequency spectrum. Does that make sense? So effectively the tonal footprint that's coming into the second filter is going to be varying based on the LFO movement of the first one. I know, it's exciting, isn't it? So what we're going to do again is to introduce some LFO movement, but this time what I want to do is to introduce a little bit more. Again, I'm going to introduce a little bit of resonance. So the resonance of the first filter is being passed into the second. It's effectively being picked up and made even more significant. And this time what I'm going to do is to select a rate of a half note, something much quicker. Now to show you what this filter is doing, I'm going to bypass the first one. So the second filter sounds like this. I'm giving it a little bit of post-filter distortion too, because why not? Okay, so the two working together, remember this one is now feeding this one. Okay, so that's working really nicely, this kind of weird undulating pattern that's arriving as a result of one filter feeding the other. But it definitely feels like everything's a little bit too murky. Okay, well, I can fix that in two ways. Firstly, I can increase the amount of high frequency content that is coming out of the first filter. And what I can also do is to slightly increase the amount of cutoff frequency, which is being added or effectively LFO'd at the second. And what I could also potentially do would be to just limit that amount of movement a tiny bit more. Now, you know what's better than two filters? We're going to add one more. I'm going to move this one out of the way. Let's see if there's space for all three. Of course, I can resize this. So let's do that. We'll just put these out of the way a little bit, and we're going to add one more. Now, the last thing I want to do in this kind of collection of filters isn't to add yet another sort of filter movement using an LFO, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the kick drum, which is on Drum Machine Designer, this pattern that's being generated up at the top. So therefore it's going to be an instrument, and I'm going to come and choose this kick sound. And effectively what's going to happen is that this is going to come into the AutoFilter. Now, there isn't an immediately obvious place to understand exactly what the sidechain input does within the AutoFilter. There isn't a dial that says sidechain input trigger or anything along those lines. I've routed it in, but what does it actually do? Well, it turns out that what it does is to control the envelope amount. So in other words, the kick drum is going to affect the way that the envelope behaves on this particular filter. So firstly, I need to choose a filter shape. And again, I need to choose a brightness. Again, I'm going to go with a low pass filter by default, just to sort of set this. So effectively, I'm going to keep this nice and bright from a potential point of view. In other words, the filter has the potential to be really bright. But of course, what's going to happen now is that if I drop the threshold so that lots of the signal is processed, now it's the attack, decay, sustain and release dials that are going to control exactly how this filter behaves. Now, to make this fairly obvious, I'm going to drop the sustain level to 0. So there isn't any sustain now. So effectively the filter is now being completely controlled by the attack time and the decay time. Let's keep the decay short as well, and we'll hear what we've got. Now you can just about hear that little tick on each beat as the kick drum comes in and makes a difference to the sound. But at the moment, obviously, we're losing so much of what we had before. So firstly, I am going to put the sustain level back up to about 50%. But also what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary the decay time. And what this is going to do is to allow the sound to stick around for a bit longer before the next kick drum comes along to act as the next sidechain input signal. But whether I'm going to do that is here. And I think there might be a sort of millisecond value that makes musical sense here. In other words, a decay that feels like it's kind of in time with the track. Let's have a listen. I really like that. Let's have a listen to that in the context of the whole track. Okay, so as you can see, I'm finding it absolutely irresistible not to start thinking about the way that we could automate some of these parameters, because remember that effectively, the effect, I think I've said that before. It's not great, is it? But I've said it now. But the impact, there's a word, that the first filter has on the second and that the second has on the third basically means that we can almost create a kind of princess and the pea situation where we've got an opportunity to kind of plant an idea in one plugin, which then passes down through the next and then onto the next. And even Filter Freak 2 doesn't have 3 filters. So we cracked it. So effectively what we've got here is this opportunity to completely redefine what a loop can be. I've sort of turned it into a kind of topper style loop in the way that I described I wanted to. But much more importantly, not only have we created a unique sound, but hopefully what we've got is something which feels like from a pattern perspective, it's undulating and doing interesting things. Another thing you could try if you like this idea would be in the third filter to have an LFO that either is a ramp or is coming the other way back up, or it's doing some sort of movement as the first one does the sort of regular movement. Loads of ways that you could kind of create interesting undulations, including in fact creating dotted patterns or triplets, all sorts of things. But if you like this idea of having tone change that is dynamic and unpredictable, this is a really interesting technique to go and check out.